Hello, I'm Jim Mathis. Lately it seems that I've been noticing how often I'm the oldest person in the room. So I don't know how old you are or who's watching this, but I want to take a quick survey. How many people here were outraged when the price of coffee at your favorite coffee house went from 5 cents to 10 cents? Anybody? How many people here were college age or older when you saw the first McDonald's restaurant? I was just trying to remember the other day if hamburgers were 15 cents or 19 cents. I don't remember for sure, but I do know that you could get a hamburger and a fries, a medium drink, and change back for half a dollar. How many people remember what a half a dollar looks like? I don't know what happened to those things. I grew up in a very small town. We had no traffic lights, no stop signs, no police department. In fact, nobody even used a turn signal because everybody already knew where you were going. There was a sign at the edge of town that said, population 245 friendly people and one old grouch. And the big discussion was, who was the old grouch? It probably could have said a couple of old grouches and it still would have stopped the conversation a little bit. When I was about 10 years old, I started going to church and Sunday school with some kids from school. The church was only slightly smaller than the town because just about everybody went to the same church. One Sunday morning, this big snowstorm and nobody could get out. And the pastor got there because he lived right next door to the church. And one old farmer finally showed up about time to start. And apparently he drove in on his tractor and he walked in and sat down at his normal spot, third row from the back, right side. Pastor walked back to him and said, well, looks like it's just you and me. What do you suppose we ought to do? Farmer thought for a minute and he said, if I went out on a cold morning like this and to feed my cattle and only one old cow showed up, I'd still feed her. Pastor thought for a minute and he said, I believe you're right. So he got up and he said, okay, everybody take out your hymnals and turn to page 283 and we'll sing all three verses of Love Lifted Me and sing a couple more hymns and had a pastoral prayer and he took up an offering and then they had communion and then the pastor preached a 45-minute sermon with 19 points and stamped his hand on the pulpit a few times and waved the Bible around a few times and finally concluded with an invitation and he said, we're going to sing Just As I Am, and if there's anybody here who wants to give their life to Christ, come down forward and come down. And they stopped between each verse and says, we're going to sing one more verse if you want you come. Finally got through all 6 verses and did the benediction. The pastor beat it back to the back of the church where the farmer was sitting there and he said, well, what did you think of the sermon? The service. And the farmer said, if I went out on a cold morning to feed my cattle and just one old cow showed up, I'd still feed her. I just don't think I'd give her the whole load. It was on one of those kind of days when I was there along with a few other people. And so this time I decided that when they sing Just As I Am, I'd go forward. So my decision was, would I go after the 3rd verse or the 4th verse? And I got to thinking, well, what if I die this week and they only do 4 verses? I better go. So after 3rd verse, I got up from my seat and walked down front. Pastor shook my hand and he said, Jimmy, do you believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of the living God? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And I was baptized. And when I came up out of that water, I knew I was a new creature. I knew that my name was written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And I knew for certain that when that roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. I also began to realize that I had maybe 60, 70 years to just kind of hang around the station waiting for that train to glory. I don't recall anybody ever actually telling me that I need to live my life any different than anybody else. I've been a business owner for 55 years. I started my first business was selling eggs out of the trunk of my car when I got my first car and my driver's license when I was 16 years old. Nowadays we'd call them free-range organic, but in those days we just said farm fresh. That's when I first learned that you could get a premium price for a premium product. Actually, the egg business wasn't my first business. My first business was when my buddy Steve Muller and I started M&M Rent-A-Rule to rent rulers to our classmates in the third grade that couldn't remember to bring their rulers to class. We soon expanded to other school supplies as well. And we also had the M&M Bottle Company, where we picked up pop bottles along the side of the road and sold them back to the store for 2 cents a piece. My high school was also a vo-tech school. So like a lot of my friends, when I graduated from high school, I got both a high school diploma and a trade school diploma. That's why the argument which is better, trade school or college, never made much sense to me, because it's not as if you can't do both. And in fact, to me, the ideal education would be a trade school and a liberal arts college. Since my trade school diploma was in electronics, I started out majoring in electrical engineering at Kansas State University. The engineering school was not exactly what I thought it was going to be, because my trade school buddies were all into building things, and there were engineering students at K-State that didn't even have a favorite soldering gun. Can you imagine? So after a couple of years, after I'd finished my required math and physics classes, I decided to transfer to finance in the business school. Now, finance in college is basically trade school for people who want to be bankers or CFOs. Also, when I got to college, I found out that you can make good money playing rock and roll. Soon we were driving about 100,000 miles a year, playing to college kids in Manhattan and Hayes and Lincoln and Fayetteville, and to farmers and ranchers in Goodland and Salina and Dodge City and Guyman, Oklahoma. We played one particularly rowdy little town that actually had chicken wire in front of the bandstand to protect the musicians from flying beer bottles. Our instructions were that when a fight broke out, just to keep playing and the bouncers would take care of it, and that actually happened quite often. It was the type of place where they check you for guns at the door. If you don't have one, they give you one. Actually, that used to be a joke, but now I'm pretty sure in that town everybody already carries a gun. The reason we made money playing music, and this is important, don't miss this, we made money because we weren't just playing in a band, we were in the music business. My dad was an auctioneer, so I spent my youth hanging around auctions, working at auctions, and then later working in a pawn shop, and then traveling around the country playing in a blues band gave me a pretty solid business education and helped me develop a pretty good judge of character. 1971 was a monumental year for me. I met this beautiful lady. We decided to get married. We got married, moved to Kansas City. I quit the music business and got started in the photography business. A couple of years later, we opened a custom black and white photo lab in Overland Park. We were immediately successful, and the reason is that we had the distinct advantage of having absolutely no idea what we were doing. Neither one of us had ever even been in a photo lab before. You see, at the time, photo finishing was in a death spiral to the bottom, a race to the bottom. Everybody was cutting costs, cutting prices, lowering quality. We decided to ignore all that and just make the best possible product we could. One day, when I was about 30, I began to look around and realized that we had missed something. We had a new house, 2 new cars, everything was going great. Life was wonderful, except something was missing. We seemed to have no purpose. All of our dreams were coming true, but we realized we probably had the wrong dreams. The turning point came one time when we decided to upgrade our stereo in our house. We spent the equivalent of several $1,000s for new stereo gear, and a couple days later we looked at each other and we agreed that neither one of us could really tell the difference. And in fact, we had just wasted a whole bunch of money, and in fact, we had gone nuts. So we started asking some of our friends what their purpose in life was, what they got them going in the morning and so forth, and after quite a few conversations, eventually somebody invited us to church. Immediately, like the very first week, somebody invited us to a couple's Bible study. So we began to learn that who Jesus really was and what it meant to be a follower of Christ. And each of us made a renewed commitment. We'd had some religious experiences as young people, youth group and so forth, but neither one of us had really understood what it meant to be a follower of Christ. I went from a 10-year-old's view of God to an adult's view. Somebody in our group mentioned that they were going to a navigators conference, and I said, "Oh, are you involved with aviation?" And they said, "No, that's a Christian organization." I said, "Oh, I didn't know that." And then somebody else said they were going to a Christian businessmen's committee meeting, and I thought, well, shoot, I'm a Christian, I'm a businessman, I probably ought to be involved with that. So we got involved with navigators and a Christian businessmen's committee, and before long we were meeting with people practically every day of the week. In fact, every day of the week sometimes, with either one-on-one or in small groups or leading Bible studies and ground ministry classes. And we went through Memorize the Word. We started leading Memorize the Word classes and so forth. It was also during this time that we cut back and started working just 4 days a week. Like most other businesses that only work 4 days a week, our productivity went way up, and we basically made the same amount of money doing 4 days we were working 5 or 6 days. Americans work more hours than any other industrialized country in the world, and we're the least happy. By the way, the best records we have, we don't know for sure, but the nearest we can tell that during the Middle Ages, like 1,000 years ago, the average person worked about 28 hours a week. And they did a lot more time socializing than we do today. In 1996, we realized that digital was coming, and we were in the film business. So our days of film processing were numbered. The area director of CBMC, Charlie Williams, who was in St. Louis, asked us to pray about selling our business and coming on staff with CBMC. And we agreed to pray about it. We were actually over in St. Louis at Charlie and Tammy's house, and he said, "I'm going to pray that you'll sell your business and you'll be able to come on staff with CBMC's Christian Businessmen's Committee." So we said, "Okay, fine." So it was Sunday afternoon. The next day, Monday morning at 10 o'clock, two guys came walking in and said they wanted to buy our business. So we just started laughing. He said, "God has such a sense of humor and has perfect timing." So we sold it to him, and in April of 1996, I came on staff with CBMC as the Metro Director in Kansas City. Before long, we realized that we needed a place to meet, not just like a church where you meet 2 hours a week or so, but a place where people could come anytime and just hang out, meet new friends, talk about what they want to talk about, a place we have Bible study groups, or anybody could come anytime, and maybe a place where we could have live music on the weekends and have local art on the walls and so forth. And that all came together in 2001 when we opened Homer's Coffee House at the corner of 80th and Metcalf. Homer's became a lighthouse to the city. Our goal of being a community center came true. It was a place where people could meet friends and so forth. In 2002, I received an award from the Downtown Overland Park Partnership for the person who had done the most revitalized downtown Overland Park that particular year. 18 years later, I'm happy to say Homer's is still going strong, still has the same vision we had 20 years ago. I also started writing a monthly and then a weekly newsletter, and I enjoyed it so much I eventually started writing books. The first book I wrote was Saving the World One Latte at a Time, the story of Homer's Coffee House. It was in 2005. So in 2008, I left Homer's and CBMC to get back in the photography business. By this time, the transition from chemical-based photography to electronics-based photography was complete. So I rented a studio space in Corporate Woods in Overland Park. One of the first major projects I had was ghostwriting a manual for digital photography. I wrote this for a teacher who was teaching photography. It worked pretty good, so I decided to rewrite it under my own name and call it High Performance Cameras for Ordinary People. My latest book is called The Camel and the Needle. It's about two things I know quite a bit about: the Bible and money. The title comes from a story in the Bible about a young man who approached Jesus one day, asking about what he should do to inherit the kingdom of heaven. He said that he had kept all the commandments since he was a youth, basically did everything he was supposed to do. He was a good kid, involved with youth group and all that kind of stuff, but he thought he must have missed something. He knew that Jesus was the man to ask because he had a reputation as a good teacher. Now, it was a norm in those days for well-educated people, which Jesus was, to gather disciples around them and travel around speaking. Many teachers would travel around speaking, and their close disciples would travel with them and learn from the master, expecting to take over the teaching duties someday. Jesus was not unique in this respect. He was unique in that he claimed to be God, he performed miracles, and he rose from the dead. He was not unique in that he was a good teacher and he traveled around speaking. Some of the other people who did that you may have heard of, who also had disciples, traveled around lecturing and so forth, were Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and Confucius. So being asked by a great teacher was like getting a full scholarship to Harvard or Stanford. When Jesus called Peter, James, John, and the others, they jumped at the chance. It was an opportunity to learn from a master, to get a first-class education. It would be a few centuries before teachers started gathering together, rabbis, professors, and so forth, began to gather together in permanent locations and have the students come to them, and we call those places colleges and universities. However, Plato did have a permanent place. Plato had a place where he lived, and his disciples lived with him, his followers, students, and other people came to listen and learn, and it was a town called Academy, where we get our English word academy. And by the way, Plato, best we know, Plato is buried there, and he's still dead. So the fishermen had left their boats. Matthew had left his job with the IRS. The others have given up businesses, left family, and other opportunities to be with Jesus. You might think of traveling with Jesus, being one of his disciples, like going away to college. They weren't just hanging out. It was a full-time job, a full-time commitment to learn. So because Jesus knew this young man's heart and knew that the wealth would be a barrier, he told him to sell off his possessions, give them to the poor, and then come follow him. He needed to divest himself of all that extra baggage and probably responsibility he was carrying around, most likely inherited wealth. But the man went away dejected because he was very wealthy. The money was an overpowering presence in his life. Probably out of a sense of frustration, Jesus turned to his disciples as the man was walking away, and he said, it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for the camel to go through the eye of a needle. He then softened that comment just a little bit by saying, well, with God, all things are possible. In other words, it would take a miracle. It's not likely to happen, but it's possible. There was a story going around, actually it's been going around for probably a few hundred years now, that there was this gate at the city of Jerusalem that was so low that the camels had to get down on their knees to get through it, and it was called the eye of the needle. So it was hard for a camel to go through the eye of the needle because it was this low city gate. Well, it's unlikely that there ever was a low gate, and if there was, it probably was not called the eye of a needle, certainly not in Jesus' time. It's a totally made-up story. And in fact, the camel going through an eye of a needle was probably a common expression. Other ancients writings from that time had the expression pushing an elephant through the eye of a needle to indicate something's impossible. So in modern terms, what Jesus may have said, instead of saying it's easier a rich man, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven as is a camel to go through the eye of a needle, he could have said a rich man has a snowball's chance in hell of getting into heaven. That was the connotation, and that was the point he was making. The simple reason is that we cannot serve both God and money. We have to decide. If we have a lot of money, it's going to be extremely hard for it not to control our lives. Interestingly, if we don't have any money, the desire for money is going to control our lives as well. Jesus went on to say that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. In other words, what we own, our money, our houses, our cars, our stuff is not us. It's over here. Think of it as exterior to us. It's beside us. That's our stuff that might have some sort of legal claim on it. We might have a title or a name on a bank account. That's not us. Who we are is our experiences, our relationships, our education. That's what we need to be spending our time and resources on ourselves, is who we are, and our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. The things we own are not us at all. That's what Jesus said. Man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Those other guys, Aristotle, Socrates, and even King Solomon in the book of Proverbs, have been saying the same thing for years. This was not news. But we still don't get it. So this brings up a lot of questions, like, who is rich? Am I rich? Do I even want to be rich? Mae West said, I've been rich and I've been poor, but rich is better. But is it really? The Apostle Paul in Philippians 4 basically said, I've been rich and I've been poor, and it doesn't really make that much difference. He went on to say, in the same paragraph, same sentence, basically, he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's a famous verse in Philippians 4:13. He was still talking about his money. He didn't mean that nothing is impossible. He said, I have everything I need to do everything God calls me to be. I have all the resources I need. I can do anything because Christ strengthens me. So he was still talking about his money. We sometimes take that verse out of context. I've heard it said that if you own your own car, have a roof over your head that protects you from the weather, and can order a pizza from your phone, you're in the top 5 or 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. That may be statistically true, but there are a lot of people who can do all those things who are just one paycheck away from being homeless. And I wouldn't call them wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. So, does God want us to be poor? Maybe we should sell everything and give it all to the poor and follow Jesus. Take a vow of poverty. Millions of people have already done that. Monks, priests, nuns, missionaries, Mother Teresa, for example. So is being poor more godly than being rich? Maybe. Maybe not. The truth is, if we sell everything we have and give the money to the poor, the net result is one more poor person. So maybe we could redefine what it means to be rich. Maybe we should consider where the money came from, or where it comes from. Is it from oppressing workers, charging exorbitant interest to people who can afford it least? Or maybe managing a corporation strictly to increase the stock price, or to ensure healthy bonuses for the top executives, with little regard to employees or customers. When I was in college at Kansas State University, taking finance and economics classes, the professor in a financial management class wrote on the board the first day, blackboard those days, the purpose of every business enterprise is to increase the wealth of the owners. It was on every test. We had to memorize it. If this had been a grade school, we probably would have had it written in our notebooks 100 times. But since it was just a college class, the professor just wrote it on the blackboard 3 times a week. That didn't ring true at the time, and all these years later, I realized how dangerous that idea was. Even then, in 1968, some people were beginning to realize that there was a better way to run a business. That perhaps commerce could benefit everybody and be a force for good, and not just extract resources and make the rich richer. Business can be win-win. Everybody should benefit from a good business. There doesn't have to be winners and losers. A recent issue of Forbes magazine ran a cover story saying that we must define a new type of capitalism. We have to think about the planet and all the people in it, not just stockholders and owners. Maybe employees and customers are equally important, and they need a voice at the table. Forbes is now publishing a Just 100 list of companies that do the best at serving their customers, providing a good workplace, a good place to work, serving the community, and helping the environment. The old way of doing business has led to the widest gap between rich and poor in the history of the world, especially in the United States. I think it's important to note that when the God of the universe decided to come to earth in the form of a man, he did not come as a king or as a peasant, but as a middle-class tradesman. The King James Version of the Bible says that Jesus was a carpenter, like his father Joseph. And the newer translations decide that's pretty close, so they've just left it that generally. But the word that's translated carpenter is probably more accurately translated woodworker. I realize that woodworker and carpenter are similar, that's why it's kind of the same word. But may even be more likely translated as wood carver. You see, wood was a rare commodity and valuable commodity in ancient Palestine. We didn't build houses. They didn't build houses out of wood. Wood was reserved for furniture or decorative items or utensils. So Jesus didn't build houses. He more likely built furniture or maybe bowls or maybe even musical instruments. He was much more of a skilled craftsman or artisan than we usually think. In fact, the first reference to the Holy Spirit in the Bible is in the book of Exodus, where it refers to God giving people skills of wood carving, jewelry making, and embroidery. See, God loves beautiful things. He's a creative God. He made us in His image to be creative. He made the world a beautiful place, and He expects us to add to the beauty, not destroy it. If we make good stuff, He will provide everything we need. That's the biblical view of business, making good stuff, serving people. The book of Proverbs says, "See a man skilled in his work, he will stand before kings." Doing good work, serving others, glorifies God. I became aware of Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, while studying economics in college, but I didn't get around to reading all 950 pages of it till this year. See, Smith was an 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher. He's sometimes called the father of modern economics and even sometimes the father of capitalism because of one little thing he said. In The Wealth of Nations, he commented that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when each person does what is best in his own eyes, or each person is looking out for his own self-interest, doing the best he can for his own self, sometimes society is better off. Sometimes the whole country does better when everybody is looking out for their own self. In other words, if it's every man for himself, we're likely to do better. You know, an analogy might be in a race. If everybody's running the fastest they can, the times will be faster than if everybody's helping each other along. There's people going to be left behind, but overall, society might be better off. That's the basic definition of capitalism, every man for himself. The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, which you may have recalled is when the United States was founded, so I'm sure it had a big impact on our founding fathers. And because of that, for the next 158 years, the official government policy for the federal government was laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French word that basically means do whatever you want. So depending upon your perspective, laissez-faire either means freedom or lawlessness. It also gave way to this thing called social Darwinism, which assumes that if someone is making a lot of money, somehow or another they must be smarter than other people or somehow special, somehow better, so they need to be encouraged and given a little free rein and they can do whatever they want because they're making money. And conversely, kind of above the law, and conversely, people who are poor, they must be lazy or not very smart, and they're a drag on society. They need to be discouraged. We don't need those kind of people around. That was the general attitude in this country for a long time, most of the history of the country, and in fact, it's still a pretty dominant idea among some people. And this attitude has led to all kinds of meanness. Everything from predatory lending, to selling tainted food, to market prescription drugs, racism, exclusionary immigration laws, and even slavery. For much of the history of the United States, employers could issue their own money, and this was true especially in mining companies and lumber companies if they're in remote places. Instead of paying their employees with money issued by a bank or the government, they'd issue their own money. This was called scrip. And it was only good at the company store or company stores in some places, or for paying rent on company-owned housing. So often they would take your rent out of your pay, and if there wasn't enough money left over to buy groceries at the company store, that was fine. They'd give you credit and just take it out of your next pay. And before long, you were so far in debt that you couldn't afford to quit. You've all heard the song by Tennessee Ford. This was a big hit. It's #1 hit in 1955. It was written by Merle Travis, and Travis's father was a coal miner in Kentucky. And one time he remarked that he couldn't afford to die because he owed too much to the company store. So Travis wrote that down, and he wrote this song. You load 16 ton, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. That practice was outlawed in 1934 with the Fair Labor Act of 1934. It was basically another form of slavery. Enough evil has been done in the name of capitalism that barely a majority, 51% of Americans, view capitalism in a positive light. It's clearly time for a new form of capitalism, a new progressive form of capitalism. The Bible talks a lot more about community. It doesn't talk about every man for himself. It talks about helping one another, encouraging one another, lifting one another up. We're all on the same team. Adam Smith made a few other observations. He said that capitalism is based on the free movement of goods, services, and people, not only within a country, but between countries. He was opposed to tariffs and immigration laws on economic grounds because they prevented people from going to where the work was and merchants from selling where they can get the best prices for their product. Immigration laws and tariffs hurt everybody. There's no exceptions. Adam Smith also insisted that business was a partnership between the government and the merchants and individuals. Now remember, he was writing in the 18th century. He addressed this to the King of England, so he's talking to the king. He said the government's responsibility, the king's responsibility, among other things, is to provide a level playing field so business can take place in a good environment. And then the king's responsibility is to provide roads, bridges, seaports, shipping lanes, and in Adam Smith's words, freedom from bandits and pirates. I talk a lot more about this balance between public and private sector in my book, The Camel and the Needle. It would not be a stretch at all to say that greed is the engine that drives capitalism. It is the desire for just a little bit more that motivates most businesses and most business people. A few more sales, a little more profit. That's the basic motivation behind the majority of businesses. And it's really hard to reconcile this idea with the biblical understanding that greed is one of the most basic of sins. A synonym for greed is gluttony. We usually think of gluttony as overeating, but it's really just overconsumption. Too much stuff. A little more. If an 8-ounce steak is good, a 16-ounce steak must be twice as good. If a 2,500 square foot house is good, a 5,000 square foot house is twice as good, and a 10,000 square foot house is twice as good as that. Why? Because it's more, it's bigger, it's better. That's the definition of gluttony. And this desire for more is called greed. They're basically the same thing. So what is the solution? God gives us a solution. We can't receive from God with our hands holding tightly to our belongings. The Bible gives us a clear cure for greed. It's called generosity. Jesus said in Matthew 6:19 and 20, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust consume and thieves break in and steal, but instead lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moths nor rust consume and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And Paul and Timothy told Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:17 to command those who are rich to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and willing to share. The only possible way to break the stranglehold that money can have on our lives is to give it away. That's why Jesus told that rich young man to sell what he had and give it to the poor, because he knew the stranglehold that money had on his life. Giving is the first step, and in fact the only way to control greed. The Bible is clear. Those who have the world's goods should give freely to those in need. In fact, we know that oftentimes God provides plentifully to some people so that they can help other people in need. Numerous times scriptures talk about helping the poor. Jesus said several times, "The poor will be with you always," or more correctly translated, "You'll be with the poor always." Your job from now on will be helping the poor. Giving to the poor is a consistent theme throughout every section of the Bible and every circumstance. It's easy to measure our own generosity. If we have employees, do we pay them all we can afford, or as little as we can get away with? And how much do we tip? How do you feel about that? Do you have a giving plan that includes helping the poor? For the last 9 years, I've been a tax professional. I'm an enrolled agent, which is the highest designation given to a tax pro by the Internal Revenue Service. In that capacity, I've done thousands of state and local income tax returns, both individual and corporate, and that gives me a front row seat on the economy. I know how people are doing firsthand. I see their tax returns, thousands of them. I ask every single client about their charitable contributions. The vast majority have none. An amazing number of high-income people are very proud of the $50 they gave to United Way, or maybe the sack of old clothes they took to a thrift store. The few people who tithe, that is, give 10% of their income to God, the few people who do that are generally lower income people. In fact, a typical tither makes about $40,000 a year and gives away about $4,000. As income goes up, the percent of giving goes down. In general terms, obviously there are many exceptions, but I'm talking about on average in general. Money just has too much control over people. King Solomon and Benjamin Franklin and many wise folks in between have pointed out that whoever desires money will never have enough. That is in the book, both the book of Ecclesiastes and in Poor Richard's Almanac. In other words, it should be common knowledge by now. There's been a lot of research done about the relationships between money and happiness. It turns out it's pretty much a bell curve. If you think of low income, poor people on one end and high income, wealthy people on the other end, and happiness up here, the curve kind of goes like this, like that. With the happiest people in the middle, least happy people being low income and high income. Incidentally, when they survey countries and ask how happy in general everybody is in a country, it turns out the countries that are the happiest are the ones that have the lowest amount of income inequality. In other words, the largest middle class, the least number of poor, and least number of rich people. Makes perfect sense. One time the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus, so they asked him if they should pay taxes. He pointed to a coin and said, "Whose picture's on the coin?" They said, "Caesar." He said, "Okay, give to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's." Now, the first time I read that, what I heard was that we should give to God the same amount we give to Caesar. That's not what Jesus said, but that's what he said to me. So, ever since that time, we've had kind of an informal goal of giving away about the same amount of money as we pay in taxes. And over the number, 30, 40 years, it's worked out pretty much that way. Our giving is pretty much equal to our taxes. And the beautiful thing is, the more you give, mostly the time you can deduct that, and that reduces your taxes. So it's a miracle. How wonderful is that? Of course, I have some ideas on tax reform. I have done a lot of thinking about this, and that would encourage charitable giving, such as maybe a payroll deduction for charity, that people give to their favorite charity right off the top of their payroll. But to tell you the truth, that's way down the list of priorities for people who write taxes. For the simple reason is that charitable contribution deductions affect so few people. Jesus said that the first, and in fact the greatest commandment, is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He went on to explain that a neighbor is anybody you see that has a need. I would add right after that the way we show love toward God is to love His creation, which is all the world and all the people in it. Thanks.